everybody, and welcome to the Cambridge Union. We are so glad that you could join us this evening. Today, we will be hearing from Senator Ted Cruz. Senator Cruz is one of the most influential American senators as the junior senator from Texas. In 2003, he became the youngest appointed Solicitor General in the United States, arguing numerous cases in front of the Supreme Court. He is the New York Times best-selling author of A Time for Truth, Reigniting the Promise of America, and has recently authored a new book, One Vote Away, A Chronology of the Importance of the Supreme Court. In 2012, he defeated the Texas Lieutenant Governor in arguably the largest upset in the country. Ever since his election to the Senate in 2012, he became a firebrand of the right-leaning Republican Party and spoke on the Senate floor for more than 21 hours in 2013. Most recently, he came in second to President Donald Trump in the Republican primary election in 2016, winning 12 states. During the presidential impeachment trial earlier this year, the senator served as a key advisor to the president and was crucial in the legal arguments, successfully acquitting him. Please join me in welcoming Senator Cruz. Senator, the floor is yours.
Well, Tara, thank you very much. It is great to be with you. Let me first of all say what an incredible honor it is to join you at the Cambridge Union. I wish I were there in person. I very much would enjoy the give and take and personal interactions. Unfortunately, in the age of COVID, we're doing these virtually instead. But I look forward at some point to a return to normalcy. I will say the Cambridge Union has such a tremendous tradition of passionate engagement on the great issues of the day. When I was in college, I was a college debater. It consumed an enormous amount of my time, and I was at Princeton and loved being a college debater, loved engaging in the back and forth. And what I would encourage everyone, we're at a time in the political world, in American history and world history, where divisions are really intense, where people feel enormous passion and anger and vitriol, and we're divided in a way that I don't know that we've seen in a really long time. And what I would encourage folks at the Cambridge Union and everyone participating to do is focus on ideas, focus on issues, focus on substance, but also engage with each other as people. I think it is unfortunate to see the anger, the bitterness, the nastiness we have right now. One of the things I think for me, I saw firsthand as a college debater is that ideas matter. Substance matter. Ideas have a potential to change the world. I think the great debate that has raged across civilizations is the debate between free enterprise and socialism, and what is the appropriate balance? What economic systems maximizes human well-being? I think that's a debate worth having. I think that's a debate worth having based on facts, based on evidence, based on substance. And I think it's something, as you're a student, it is easy to be filled with incredible passion. And I want to tell you, as you go on to graduate and move into the world, don't lose that passion. Keep every bit of that vigor for transforming the planet. But recognize that people of goodwill, of good intelligence, can disagree. It's one of the unfortunate realities of public discourse today that an awful lot of folks engage in reductionist caricature, viewing anyone who disagrees as either stupid or evil. And that is generally not the case. And it's not productive if you ever actually want to convince someone of something. I would encourage all of you to think about whatever issue it is you care most passionately about, whatever wakes you up in the morning, what gets your blood flowing, and imagine of how someone of intelligence, of principles, of morals, of integrity could look at that issue you care most about and come to 180 degrees the opposite position. And imagine how your mother could come to the opposite position. And if we engage on substance, if we engage with respect, not dealing with ad hominem attacks, not dealing with personal insults, but instead starting with the proposition that most people would like to see the world a better place. Most people would like to see people's material well-being improved. Most people would like to see poverty defeated. Most people would like to see happiness and peace. Then we can have a real discussion about, all right, what policies work? What actually succeeds in defeating poverty? Look, one of the reasons why I am in the political arena is because I believe free enterprise has been the most effective tool for defeating poverty in the history of humanity. That it has lifted more people out of squalor. It has produced more opportunity, more prosperity. And I think socialism has a very sorry record of not succeeding, of universalizing poverty and hurting people's material well-being. That's a discussion we can and should be having. But it is far better when it is a discussion on substance and the merits. And I'll make one final point, and then we'll open to the Q&A, because really the heart of this is having a conversation. But ideas have the power to change the world. In my office in the Senate, the dominant feature in the office is this gigantic painting that hangs above the couch. And it is a painting of Ronald Reagan standing before the Brandenburg Gate. And above him in German are scrawled the words, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." And it's written in the style of the graffiti that was on the wall. Many of you perhaps do not know the backstory behind that speech. So when that speech was being written, 3 times the US State Department crossed that line out of the speech. 3 times they said, you can't say this. And they argued with President Reagan. They said, Mr. President, you can't say this. It's too bellicose. It's too aggressive. It's too provocative. And their most important argument, they said, it is too unrealistic. Mr. President, you need to understand the Berlin Wall will stand for all time. It will never come down. And so you can't say this. And 3 times Reagan, with his own hand, wrote the words back in. And he said with a twinkle in his eye, he said, you don't understand. This is the whole point of the speech. And when President Reagan stood before the Brandenburg Gate and called out the tyranny of the Soviet Union, the oppression of communism, the suffering behind that gate, less than 3 years later, that wall was torn to the ground. And critically, it wasn't knocked down by American tanks. It wasn't bombed by missiles. It was torn down by the power of ideas. It was torn down by the power of speaking the truth and shining the light of justice on the oppression that was occurring behind that wall. And so I just want to encourage you that you too, you can fight for the issues that matter most to you. Truth matters, and so does being a happy warrior and engaging on the substance of what you're discussing. And with that, let's do whatever questions you like.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Senator Cruz. That was really uplifting in a time when sometimes free ideas definitely seem under attack. My first question is sort of about that exchange of ideas. What would you say has been your favorite legislative moment throughout your years in the Senate?
I think my favorite moment was in 2017, passing school choice legislation. So what was happening? It was when we were passing the big tax cut that passed in 2017, and we were on the Senate floor, and I introduced an amendment that became the only amendment that passed on the Senate floor that was actually added something to the tax bill. And what it concerned is what are called college 529 accounts. Those are tax advantage savings accounts that parents and grandparents could save to pay for college expenses. And the amendment I introduced expanded them so that you can still save for college expenses, but you could also use 529 accounts to save for K through 12 education. So you could save for save to help provide educational choices to your kids. And school choice is an issue I am deeply, deeply passionate about. It's an issue I've been really active and involved in for 25 years. And I think school choice is the civil rights issue of this century. That if you want to see people have a chance at prosperity, a chance at their dreams, education is the gateway. It's the gateway to conquering just about every other societal problem we have. So as we were voting on my amendment, at the time, the Republicans had a 52-48 majority. And first one and then a second Republican voted no. So when we lost 2 Republican votes, it was past midnight. It was late at night. And when we lost 2 Republican votes, the Senate floor staff called the vice president's residence. In the Senate, when there's a tie, the vice president breaks the tie. And because it was past midnight, Mike Pence was at home. And so they called the vice president's office. They said, Mr. Vice President, it looks like we may need your vote. And so he got up and got in the car and started heading down in the motorcade to come to the Capitol. I was on the Senate floor, was trying to convince Lisa Murkowski, who was one of the senators who had voted no, was trying to convince her to switch her vote, and was with Tim Scott, my colleague, Republican from South Carolina, who is very passionate about school choice as well. And Tim and I were together trying to make the case to Lisa. While we were doing that, around on the side, Joe Manchin, Democrat from West Virginia, walked down and he voted yes. And there was an audible gasp in the well of the Senate. People were shocked. When that happened, the floor staff, they picked up the phone, they called the vice president's office. They said, well, we just got Manchin, Mr. Vice President, looks like we don't need your vote after all. And so the vice president, they turned the motorcade around and he started heading back to his residence. Well, Manchin returned to his desk and a sea of Democratic senators descended upon him. And they were very unhappy with his vote. They were yelling at him. I've joked that they pulled out sticks and began beating him with sticks. And about 5 minutes later, Manchin walks down to the front and rather sheepishly shifts his vote to a no. And so the Senate floor staff, once again, picks up the phone, calls the vice president's office, said, Mr. Vice President, looks like we need your vote after all. They turn the motorcade around a second time. It takes about 20 minutes to get from the Naval Observatory, which is the residence of the vice president, to the Capitol. So about 20 minutes later, Mike Pence walks onto the Senate floor. He ascends the dais and he says, the ayes being 50, the nays being 50, the Senate being equally divided, the presiding officer votes in the affirmative. The amendment is adopted. And with that, we passed what is today the most far-reaching federal school choice legislation that has ever passed. It allows parents and grandparents to save in a tax-advantaged manner up to $10,000 per child per year that can be spent in public school, private school, religious school, parochial school, whatever your choice is. And it provides an avenue for accessing education, potentially up to 50 million kids. And so that was it was an historic and a pretty neat time.
That sounds really amazing. One of my other questions also has to do with the exchange of ideas. So as a famous filibusterer, how do you feel about its its current iteration? Do you think it still holds sway in 2020, or is it anti-democratic? Should the Democrats have abolished the filibuster for circuit court judges? Where do you see the future of the filibuster going?
Well, the filibuster is anti-democratic in the sense that it is designed to slow the passions of the moment and the passions of the majority. In the United States, we don't have a pure democracy. We're not an Athenian democracy where every question of law is decided by a vote of the people. We are instead designed to be a republic where the people, there's no doubt democratic principles are at the heart of the American government system, but it's not a pure democracy. The people elect their representatives, and as y'all know, there are two houses in Congress. The House, which is elected every 2 years, which is designed to reflect the passions of the people, the passions of the moment. The House is the people's house. The Senate, 100 senators, only a third of the senators are up every 2 years. We've got 100 altogether, 6-year terms. The framers of our Constitution described the Senate as the saucer that cools the passions in the teacup or the coffee cup, that gives time for deliberation. And I think there's a balance between, you certainly want to be responsive to the needs of the moment, but you also want a time for deliberation. The Senate slows things down. That can be beneficial so that you do not act rashly. The filibuster has served likewise. It's a requirement that you have to get 60 votes to move forward on legislation. That has slowed down the operation of government. I think overall that has been beneficial, and I'll confess, this is an issue on which my views have changed. So when I first got to the Senate, if you asked me, should Republicans have ended the filibuster? My answer was no. First couple of years in the Senate, I would have said absolutely we should not end the filibuster, precisely for this reason, that slowing down the operation of government has a virtue to make sure you're not making rash decisions, and it has often prevented massive expansions in government power to be used against the citizenry. My views changed, and when Republicans had a majority in both House and Senate, I'm now one of the people who has publicly said I would have voted to end the filibuster. And the reason for that is that I do not believe it is now a bipartisan constraint. I do not believe the Democrats, if they get a majority, and we may find this out in 2 months, because right now the Senate is 50-48 for this coming Senate. There are 2 Senate seats in a runoff in Georgia on January 5th. Personally, I hope Republicans win those Senate seats and we have a 52-48 majority, in which case the filibuster will remain. But if Democrats win both Georgia seats, the Senate is divided 50-50, and if Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are president and vice president, that means the Democrats will have a narrow majority in the Senate, a 50-50 majority with Kamala Harris breaking the tie. If that occurs, I believe one of the first actions that Chuck Schumer and the Senate Democrats will do is end the filibuster. If I believed that both parties would be constrained by the filibuster, I would support maintaining it. I think the slowing of the operation of government in the passion of the moment historically has been beneficial to human liberty. The reason, as a Republican, I would have ended it is it was clear, listening to my Democratic colleagues, they no longer believed in it. They were eager to end it. And it didn't make any sense to me that it was a one-sided constraint, that it was only Republicans who were limited by the filibuster and not Democrats as well. And so I think the fate of the filibuster depends upon, at least in the short term, the outcome in these 2 Georgia runoffs that are happening January 5th.
That is very, very insightful about the different democracy changes through the filibuster. My second question concerns your famous 1-hour-long speech on the Affordable Care Act. where you said that most Americans could not give a flying flip about politicians in Washington. Who cares? Most of us are in cheap suits with bad haircuts. Do you still agree with this today? If not, how do you think politics can change to be more representative without relying on the goodwill of individual politicians?
Oh, sure. I definitely believe we've all experienced politicians that don't tell us the truth, that are interested in things other than the public good. I think much of the frustration with politics is that elected officials break their promises. That what they promise us before election day and what they actually do in office are dramatically different. You mentioned my first book, A Time for Truth. The reason I entitled it A Time for Truth was it was designed to just say, look, and what I've urged my colleagues is do what you said you would do. If you campaigned on repealing Obamacare, then actually repeal Obamacare. If you campaigned on cutting taxes, then cut taxes. Now, if you didn't, if you campaigned on something else, then fine. There's an honesty to the voters having a choice and carrying through. And the disconnect we have is dramatic. So I've suggested to a number of my colleagues, I've said, here's an interesting experiment. Go home to your state, hold a town hall, set up a whiteboard in the front, and just ask your constituents, what should our top priorities in Congress be? And just write down what they say. Just shut up and listen and write down what they say. And if you come up with the top 20 priorities, compare them to what's happening in Washington. Very few of those priorities will actually be the priorities of leadership in both parties. Flip it, however, and go to K Street is the street in Washington where a lot of the big lobbyists are headquarters. And I've said, look, go to a group of lobbyists in Washington, do the same exercise, set up a whiteboard, ask what are their top 20 priorities, and write them down. And you will find that many of those priorities are leadership's priorities. That disconnect, people are frustrated at politicians being lied to, or politicians lying to them rather. And, you know, I will say two things drive it. Number one, the dominant sentiment in the Senate is risk aversion. You know, there's an old joke that politics is Hollywood for ugly people. And I think there's some real truth to it, that you know, it is only in the world of politics that you can get short, bald, old, fat guys who can walk into a party and every joke they tell is funny and they're handsome and witty and wise. And the world of politics, elected officials, it becomes like a narcotic where they can't give it up, and it becomes their self-identity. I mean, they wake up in the morning and look in the mirror and they go, I'm a senator. You know, I must be important. And what that produces is elected officials who are terrified of losing their job, who on any big issue, any big debate, they say, well, if we take bold action on this, that'll make someone unhappy. And if someone's unhappy, they might vote me out of office. And I voted out of office, what do I do with myself? That risk aversion is an enormous problem. You know, we talked before about democracy. In many ways, I consider myself a radical Democrat in the following sense. I think the will of the people, we should respect it and listen to it within the framework of the Constitution, to be sure. But the disconnect between career politicians and the people, I think, has fueled enormous transformations in Washington. I'll also note that, you know, you look at the people who've been in Congress forever and ever who are not honoring their promises. I don't think it's that they arrived intending not to honor their promises. I think it's a series of small incremental decisions. So I'm a huge movie fan. I love movies. One of my favorite movies are the Godfather saga. Godfather 1, 2, and I'll say a radical position. I even like Godfather 3, which is almost considered heretical to say, but I do. What I find so great about the Godfather saga is that every one of the movies is a morality arc centered around Michael Corleone. And Michael Corleone, Al Pacino's character, is trying to do the right thing. He's trying to be honorable. He's trying to be decent. But he's faced with circumstances in life. You know, his father is shot. He's in the hospital. He's got to protect his dad. I mean, and so he makes a series of small, gradual choices. And then at the end of each of the 3 movies, he kills everybody. I mean, he's a mass murderer and kills everybody. I think Congress is like that, not in the mass murder sense, but in the sense of a series of small incremental compromises that you make with yourself. That you say, yeah, you know, okay, I want to do what I promised the voters, but I can't do it until I get some more seniority. I can't do it until I'm a committee chairman. I can't do it until sometime in the future. And you end up making each of these choices. And at the end of the day, an awful lot of folks end up really, really far away from where they started and what they hope to do in public service.
So my last question, and then we'll move on to student Q&A, for you, sort of concerns this learning from different ideas from constituents. So what might you and Joe Biden be able to work together on if Joe Biden is confirmed as the winner when all the votes are counted, recounts completed, and judicial processes finished?
Look, I hope a lot. I don't know. You know, Joe Biden personally is a very affable guy. It's hard to dislike Joe. When I was elected, he was vice president. I served with Joe. I remember when he swore me in January 2013, and I was there with my whole family. My girls at the time were 2 and 4. 2 exchanges that were particularly funny. So my 2-year-old Catherine, she was down on the ground and he leaned over to try to pick her up. And Catherine screamed, "Wah!" And Joe said, "It's okay, it's okay, it's okay. It's a Democrat, but it's okay." Which all of us laughed at. And then my mom was there. My mom was born in Wilmington, Delaware. And my mom is Irish and Italian. Her mother was the second youngest of 17 kids, blue collar, working class family. And so my mom, you know, I introduced my mom to Joe, and my mom said, you know, I've got hundreds of cousins in Delaware. I mean, you know, her grandmother was second youngest of 17 kids. We had lots and lots of cousins. So she told Joe that, and Joe said, they probably all voted for me. And my mom laughed and she said, yeah, you're probably right. He can be charming and affable. I actually think the degree to which we see bipartisan cooperation is likely to depend dramatically on what happens in the Georgia runoffs. If we have a Republican majority in the Senate, which I hope is the outcome, I think there may well be a chance for Joe and Republicans to work together. And if we're working together on bringing back jobs. Look, the U.S. economy has had a huge body blow. Tens of millions of Americans have lost their jobs with COVID and the shutdowns we've had. I think it needs to be an absolute driving priority to bring those jobs back and get the economy moving again. And if Joe is willing to work together productively on reducing the burdens on small businesses and job creators and helping there be more jobs and opportunity, I think that there's a lot we can work together on. If we see a Democratic majority, if Chuck Schumer is majority leader, I think there will be very little bipartisan cooperation, because I think right now the Democratic Party is captured by the extremes of that party, captured by the angry left, really driven by the Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warrens and AOCs in the party. And I think if there is a Democratic majority in the House and the Senate and the White House, I think Biden will have an incredibly difficult time saying no to the extreme left. I expect if we see a Schumer majority for them to use brute force to satisfy essentially the torch-wielding, angry left. And so all of that outcome, I think, hinges on what happens in Georgia on January 5th.
Right. That's really, really interesting. I'm now going to move on to just a couple questions from students. The first is from a student wishing to remain anonymous. They write, Ted, as someone who lived under the Chinese Communist Party tyranny for years, I witnessed the blatant human rights violations, dictatorship, brainwashing, and more firsthand in China. It's incredibly worrying to observe similar trends in the UK and the US. Mainstream media propaganda, virtue signaling, cheating, prosecution of unpopular voices. May I ask if either the Republicans or Democrats realize how much of a threat the Chinese Communist Party is to humanity, and if so, what will Trump or the Biden team do to tackle this?
Well, listen, that's a wonderful and a powerful question, and let me thank the individual who submitted it for speaking out. I think confronting the communist leadership of China is the single greatest geopolitical threat facing the United States, facing the United Kingdom over the next century. When it comes to the evil and brutality of communism, that is something that I've known, my family has known firsthand. My father was born in Cuba. My dad grew up in Cuba. When my dad was a young boy, when he was a teenager, 14, he began fighting in the Cuban Revolution. He actually began fighting alongside Fidel Castro. He did not know that Castro was a communist at the time. My dad today refers to the revolutionaries as he put it, as a bunch of 14 and 15-year-old boys that didn't know any better. What he did know was that Batista, who was the dictator of Cuba, was corrupt, was cruel, was oppressive. Batista was in bed with the mob. And so my father fought for several years in the revolution. When he was 17, my dad was thrown in prison and he was tortured by Batista's thugs. And he ended up being let out of prison. He fled Cuba and he came to the United States. He came to Texas to go to the University of Texas. When my dad arrived in the United States, he was 18. He couldn't speak English. He had $100 that was sewn into his underwear. And his first job was washing dishes, making 50 cents an hour. That was in 1957 when my dad came to America. 1959, the revolution succeeds. So Castro takes over. He declares he's a communist. He begins executing dissidents. He begins seizing people's lands. My aunt, my tia Sonia, who is my dad's younger sister, and I'm very, very close with my tia Sonia, she was still there. And so she saw the oppression of Castro and the communists as they came in. My aunt actually fought in the counter-revolution. So she and my dad fought on opposite sides because they were doing it at different time periods. And my tia Sonia ended up being thrown in prison and tortured by Castro's goons. And, I grew up as a kid literally sitting on the floor at the feet of my dad and my tia Sonia, hearing stories about being freedom fighters. And it inspired me. So when it comes to communism and the misery, the murder, the oppression, the torture that occurs, it is a real and very personal issue for me. When you look at the Chinese Communist government, last fall in October, I traveled to Asia and I did an Asia tour. And I did a tour I went from Pearl Harbor to Japan, to Taiwan, to India, to Hong Kong. And it was very much designed to be a friends and allies tour of meeting with major friends and allies all surrounding China. And the central driving issue of that trip was, how do we deal with China's increased military aggressiveness, increased espionage, increased hostility, increased use of economic blackmail, Taiwan, I attended their National Day celebration, was the first senator, I think, 34 years to be at their National Day with President Tsai. In Hong Kong, we saw 2 million dissidents take to the streets of Hong Kong, protesting for freedom, protesting for democracy. I met with many of the leaders of the dissidents, and actually did a Sunday show by satellite from Hong Kong, dressed in all black, in solidarity with the dissidents, because the dissidents dress in all black, to speak up for them. In terms of the questioner asked, do Republicans, do Democrats understand the severity and the threat of the communist Chinese government? I would say some do. I have been arguing for a long time they're an extraordinary threat. I do think one of the consequences of COVID and the COVID pandemic is an awful lot of elected officials, both in the United States and across the globe, are reassessing the Chinese Communist government. It is clear that the government of China actively lied, suppressed the truth, and contributed in a very material way to the spread of this deadly pandemic. And, you know, I will say one very real example of that. Earlier this year, I launched a podcast called Verdict with Ted Cruz. We put it out every week. It actually, when we launched it, it skyrocketed, became the #1 ranked podcast in the world. Every podcast spent about a half hour talking in substance about issues, trying to be engaged. So one of the podcasts I did, I had as a guest Nigel Farage, who was fascinating. I enjoyed it. It was a really interesting conversation. We talked about Brexit and his experiences going from a lonely voice that was viewed as sort of a radical out in the wilderness to seeing his views attract the support of the majority of the voters in the UK and really transform the political and economic world. And one of the things that Nigel and I talked about was the British government at the time moving forward with Huawei, the Chinese company that is owned and controlled by the Chinese government. The British government moving forward with Huawei installing major telecom equipment. I think that was an exceptionally bad idea because the Chinese government is not using Huawei to make money. It's not a capitalist endeavor. It is instead a spy agency. They want to install the telecom equipment because they want to intercept communications and they want to engage in espionage. And one of the things, there is an intelligence sharing group that is called the Five Eyes groups, that it is America and our closest allies, including obviously the United Kingdom, where we share the most sensitive classified information, security secrets. And a real issue from a US perspective is that if the UK installed Huawei equipment where the Chinese could intercept and potentially read those security agreements, that might well force the United States to exclude the UK from the Five Eyes group. And what I told Nigel in the discussion is I said, look, 4 eyes are better than 6 eyes, which was, you know, a shorthand way of saying, as much as we want to maintain this very close alliance, we're not willing to allow the Chinese Communist government to intercept our secure materials. After the COVID pandemic, the British government backed off and decided not to go with Huawei. I think that's an example of, in the UK and America and globally, people are realizing the threat of China. And it is certainly my intention to continue standing up for human rights, standing up against the murder, the torture, the oppression. Right now, Chinese Communist government has over 1 million Uyghurs in concentration camps. And just like, you know, in my opening, I talked about Reagan before the Brandenburg Gate. I think all of us have an obligation to speak out about the murder and oppression and tyranny. And if Joe Biden is inaugurated as the next president, I hope Biden will be willing to work with us in doing so. I don't know if he will or not, but I hope so.
Right. Well, I think that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much, Senator Cruz. for joining us. Thank you for everyone watching. And just a reminder that we have our debate on the Middle East tomorrow. Again, thank you so much, Senator Cruz. We hope to see you in person.
It has been a real pleasure. I look forward to it, and I'm going to give you a very quick anecdote from college debating days, just because it may be a nice way to wrap up. So when I was a senior in college, we went and competed at the World Debating Championship that was in Dublin, at Trinity College, Dublin. And my debate partner, David Panton, who's Jamaican, when he and I debated internationally, we'd try to hang out with whoever lived in that town and in that locale and learn a little bit about the culture and also learn a little bit of the native language. And so David was asking some young Irish students, said, okay, tell me a little bit about Gaelic. And he learned in particular a phrase in Gaelic, which is Pog Mahon. Now, Pog Mahon is Gaelic for kiss my ass. So David and I learned this at the pub over more than a few pints of Guinness. And a few days later, we're in the final round of the preliminary part of the tournament, and we are going up against Australia National University, and we were at the time, their team and our team were the top two teams in the tournament. So we were paired up together, and it was 4-team debate, so there were 4 teams all together in there, and we were in a little college classroom because it was still the preliminary rounds. And all of the Irish students from Trinity College, they came out to see it because we were the top 2 teams at the time. They wanted to see us go at each other. And the debate was about capital punishment. And the Australian team did a very, very good job presenting their case. I think their case was abolish capital punishment, if I remember right. I got up and gave a competent speech opposing it. The other side gets up, and then David is giving his speech, and the lead speaker for Australia National University rises on a point of information, and David whirls, and you've got to picture him. David is 6'3", 240 pounds, and in a lilting Jamaican accent, David goes, "Pog Mahon." Every Irish student in the room lost it. I mean, just the Speaker of the House threw his pencil in the air and began banging his head on the table. He was laughing so hard. And the poor fellow, Richard Douglas was his name, from Australia, he's standing there just completely bewildered, and he just kind of sat and crumpled in his chair. We won that round, and afterwards we overheard him walking in the hallway muttering, saying, I don't understand. I asked a perfectly good question, and somehow he just waved his hands, and I went away. It was one of my favorite moments in all of college debate. And so if you ever get into trouble, a little Gaelic might help you out.
Thank you so much. We were so glad to have you. This was great. Thank you, Senator Cruz.
Take care.